The smell of kettle corn and diesel exhaust hung thick in the September air as 17-year-old Marcus Thompson adjusted his letter jacket and checked his watch. 9:43 p.m. The Millfield County Fair was winding down, but the Ferris wheel still creaked against the star-filled Nebraska sky, its colored bulbs casting dancing shadows across the dusty midway. Marcus squeezed his girlfriend Sarah Walsh's hand, her palm slightly damp with nervous excitement from their third ride on the tilt-a-whirl. "I'll be right back," he told her, his voice barely audible over the calliope music drifting from the carousel. "Just need to find Coach Martinez about tomorrow's practice schedule." Sarah nodded, tucking a strand of blonde hair behind her ear as she watched him disappear into the thinning crowd, his broad shoulders cutting through clusters of families heading toward the parking lot with stuffed animals and half-eaten candy apples. That was the last time anyone who loved Marcus Thompson would see him alive. The fairgrounds stretched across 15 acres of what was normally Peterson's cornfield, temporarily transformed into a wonderland of spinning rides, game booths, and livestock exhibits. The annual event drew families from 3 counties, a celebration that marked the end of harvest season in this corner of rural Nebraska where everybody knew everybody, and strangers were noticed immediately. Marcus had grown up attending this fair, winning his first blue ribbon for his 4-H calf when he was 12, stealing his first kiss behind the cotton candy stand at 14. Coach Martinez would later tell investigators he never saw Marcus that night. The practice schedule had already been posted in the locker room for a week. But in those crucial minutes after 9:43, as Sarah waited by the Ferris wheel, expecting her boyfriend to return with that easy smile that had made him homecoming king, Marcus Thompson was walking towards something that would erase him from existence. The first sign something was wrong came at 10:15, when the fair's final announcement crackled over the PA system, thanking everyone for attending and reminding them to drive safely. Sarah scanned the dispersing crowd, standing on her tiptoes to peer over the heads of departing families. The Ferris wheel operator, a weathered man named Dale Hoffman, who'd been running carnival rides for 30 years, remembered her asking if he'd seen the tall kid in the red and white jacket. By 10:30, the midway was empty except for carnival workers breaking down game booths and sweeping popcorn from the dirt pathways. Sarah found Marcus's best friend, Jake Morrison, helping his father load their prize-winning Holstein into a trailer. Jake hadn't seen Marcus since earlier that evening when they'd thrown rings at milk bottles, laughing as they failed to win anything bigger than a plastic comb. The Thompsons' 1995 Ford pickup truck sat exactly where Marcus had parked it 6 hours earlier, keys still in his pocket, wallet containing $43, and his driver's license undisturbed on the dashboard where he always left it. His parents, Robert and Diana, arrived at the fairgrounds at 11 p.m. after Sarah called their house in tears, her voice shaking as she explained that Marcus had simply vanished. Sheriff Patricia Keller, a 42-year-old veteran who'd spent most of her career dealing with cattle rustling and bar fights, stood in the empty field at midnight watching the last carnival truck disappear down Highway 34. She'd already radioed the state patrol and contacted neighboring counties, but deep in her gut, she knew this wasn't a case of a teenager jogging back to town or catching a ride with friends. Marcus Thompson was responsible, reliable, and utterly devoted to Sarah Walsh. He didn't abandon people he cared about. Something had gone terribly wrong in those 32 minutes between "I'll be right back" and the fair's closing announcement, and Sheriff Keller was about to discover just how quickly a small town's sense of safety could shatter like glass in the Nebraska wind. Millfield, Nebraska, population 2,847, was the kind of place where high school football games drew larger crowds than the county courthouse, and where Marcus Thompson's name appeared on the front page of the Millfield Gazette more often than the mayor's. The town stretched along a 2-mile strip of Highway 34, anchored by grain elevators on the east end and a Casey's general store on the west, with tree-lined residential streets branching off like ribs from a backbone. Marcus had been born in the same hospital where his father Robert delivered farm equipment parts, a modest brick building that served 4 surrounding counties. Diana Thompson worked as a secretary at the elementary school, and together they'd built a quiet, stable life in a ranch-style house on Elm Street, where Marcus practiced throwing footballs at a tire swing hanging from an ancient oak tree that had weathered 50 Nebraska winters. The Thompsons were what locals called good people. They attended First Methodist Church every Sunday, Robert coached Little League during summers, and Diana organized the annual Christmas toy drive. Marcus inherited their steady character, along with his father's imposing 6'3" frame and his mother's piercing blue eyes that seemed to see straight through to a person's soul. Teachers described him as polite, but never timid, competitive, but never cruel. On the football field, Marcus was poetry in motion. As quarterback for the Millfield Eagles, he'd led the team to their first state championship appearance in 23 years. College scouts had been circling like vultures since his sophomore season, and by September 1998, he'd already committed to the University of Nebraska on a full scholarship. Coach Martinez often said Marcus possessed that rare combination of natural talent and work ethic that separated good players from great ones. But Marcus's true magic revealed itself in quieter moments. He tutored struggling classmates in algebra without being asked, helped elderly neighbors rake leaves every autumn, and never passed a stranded motorist without stopping to offer assistance. Sarah Walsh had fallen for him not because of his athletic achievements, but because of the way he remembered her grandmother's birthday and always carried extra quarters to share with younger kids at the arcade. The week before the county fair, Marcus had been juggling senior year responsibilities with increasing pressure from reporters and recruiters. He'd spent Tuesday evening at the Gazette office, patiently answering the same questions about his college plans and championship hopes. Wednesday brought a visit from a Nebraska assistant coach who sat in the Thompsons' living room, drinking Diana's coffee while discussing academic requirements and team expectations. Despite the attention, Marcus remained grounded. He still worked part-time at Henderson's Farm Supply, stacking feed bags and learning diesel engine repair from old Pete Henderson, who'd known the Thompson family for 3 generations. Pete would later tell investigators that Marcus had seemed unusually thoughtful during his Friday shift, mentioning something about figuring out what's really important when Pete asked if the college pressure was getting to him. That Saturday, Marcus had helped his father repair fencing on their modest 20-acre property before showering and picking up Sarah for their traditional fair date. They'd been going together for 2 years, since Sarah moved to Millfield when her father got hired as the bank's loan officer. She was studying to become a veterinarian, drawn to Marcus's gentle strength and his way of making everyone around him feel valued and heard. The couple had talked about their future with the easy confidence of teenagers who believed love could conquer geography and time. Marcus planned to major in agricultural business, hoping to return to Millfield after graduation and eventually take over Pete Henderson's operation. Sarah would attend veterinary school, and they'd marry in the same church where both had been confirmed. Their friends envied their relationship's stability in a world where most teenage romances lasted weeks rather than years. Marcus and Sarah complemented each other perfectly, his steady leadership balancing her passionate idealism, her curiosity challenging his sometimes overly practical nature. They rarely fought, and when they disagreed, Marcus had a gift for listening that made Sarah feel heard rather than dismissed. As September 19th dawned clear and warm, with temperatures reaching an unseasonable 78 degrees, Marcus Thompson represented everything good about small-town America. He embodied the values his community cherished: hard work, loyalty, integrity, and the belief that dedication and character would always triumph over circumstance. In 18 hours, that belief would be shattered forever. Dawn broke over Millfield with the kind of crystalline clarity that made Nebraska farmland look infinite. But Sheriff Patricia Keller hadn't slept. She stood in the Peterson field, where Carnival workers were loading the last pieces of the tilt-a-whirl onto flatbed trucks, her radio crackling with updates from patrol cars that had spent the night checking every back road within a 50-mile radius. Marcus Thompson had been missing for 8 hours, and every passing minute carved deeper lines around Keller's eyes. The Thompsons arrived at the makeshift command post she'd established in the Peterson farmhouse kitchen by 6 a.m., Diana's face drained of color, Robert's hands shaking as he poured coffee he wouldn't drink. They brought Marcus's high school yearbook photo and a detailed description of what he'd been wearing. His red and white letter jacket with Thompson 12 embroidered on the back, dark blue jeans, and Nike sneakers that squeaked slightly when he walked fast. By 7:30, word had spread through Millfield's network of church congregations, coffee shop regulars, and early morning radio listeners. Volunteers began gathering at the fairgrounds like iron filings drawn to a magnet. Pete Henderson arrived with 3 of his farm workers, their boots still caked with mud from morning chores. The Methodist church ladies brought thermoses of coffee and boxes of sandwiches wrapped in aluminum foil. Even teenagers who'd graduated with Marcus years earlier drove in from surrounding towns, their faces etched with the peculiar gravity that comes when someone your own age simply vanishes. Sheriff Keller had handled missing person cases before, but never anything like this. Usually, it was elderly folks with dementia wandering away from nursing homes, or domestic disputes where angry spouses disappeared for a few days to cool off. She'd attended FBI training seminars about coordinating large-scale searches, but theory felt inadequate when faced with 200 volunteers who wanted to help but needed direction she wasn't sure how to provide. The search dogs arrived from Lincoln at 9 a.m., German shepherds trained in cadaver detection and live tracking. Handler Jim Crawford, a lean man with weathered hands and 20 years of experience, walked the animals through Marcus's bedroom to establish scent before leading them to the fairgrounds. The dogs immediately picked up Marcus's trail from the Ferris wheel area, their noses pressed to the packed earth as they followed an invisible path that led toward the highway. At Highway 34, the trail went cold. Crawford knelt beside his lead dog, a 7-year-old shepherd named Rex, stroking the animal's head as he explained to Sheriff Keller that scent trails could be disrupted by vehicle exhaust, weather changes, or simply the passage of time. The dogs had tracked Marcus's path for approximately 200 yards before losing it completely at the asphalt road that connected Millfield to the rest of the world. Meanwhile, search teams fanned out across the surrounding farmland like spokes on a wheel. Volunteers walked shoulder to shoulder through cornfields that stretched to the horizon, their voices calling Marcus's name until the sound became a constant, haunting echo across the landscape. They checked irrigation ditches, abandoned farm buildings, and stock ponds where cattle came to drink. Every barn, silo, and equipment shed within 5 miles of the fairgrounds was systematically searched by men and women who knew this country like the lines on their own palms. The State Patrol established roadblocks on major highways, stopping every vehicle to show drivers Marcus's photograph and ask if they'd seen anything unusual the previous night. Local radio stations broadcast hourly updates, and the Omaha Television News sent a crew that arrived by noon, their satellite truck looking alien against the backdrop of grain elevators and endless sky. Sarah Walsh hadn't left the command post since arriving with her parents at dawn. She sat at the Peterson kitchen table, mechanically folding and refolding the same piece of paper while staring at the telephone, willing it to ring with news that Marcus had been found safe. Her eyes held the hollow look of someone whose world had tilted off its axis, and every time a volunteer returned empty-handed, a little more light seemed to drain from her face. As the sun reached its zenith on what should have been a typical Sunday in harvest season, Sheriff Keller realized she was coordinating the largest manhunt in county history, and they still had absolutely no idea what had happened to Marcus Thompson. The first potential break came at 2:15 p.m. when Earl Mitchell, a retired railroad worker with thick glasses and a reputation for reliability, approached Sheriff Keller with information that made her pulse quicken. Mitchell claimed he'd seen a young man, matching Marcus's description, hitchhiking along Highway 34 around 10:30 the previous night, about 2 miles east of the Fairgrounds. The figure had been illuminated briefly by Mitchell's headlights as he drove home from visiting his sister in the neighboring town of Crawford. Keller immediately dispatched 2 patrol cars to canvass that stretch of highway, interviewing every resident within a 5-mile radius. The description Mitchell provided was tantalizingly close. Tall, athletic build, light-colored jacket, but frustratingly vague. In the darkness and at 40 miles per hour, he couldn't be certain about facial features or specific clothing details. Still, it was the first concrete sighting that placed Marcus away from the fairgrounds after his disappearance. The lead seemed promising until Mitchell's wife, Agnes, mentioned that her husband had been drinking at his sister's house and his night vision wasn't what it used to be. When pressed for additional details, Mitchell's certainty began to waver. Maybe the jacket had been darker than he initially thought. Maybe the person had been shorter. The description that had seemed so clear in his mind became increasingly fluid under scrutiny. A second witness emerged Tuesday morning when Doris Hanson, who operated the food concession near the livestock barn, came forward with her own account. She remembered seeing Marcus around 9 p.m., not long before he told Sarah he'd be right back. But Hanson's story introduced a troubling new element. She insisted Marcus hadn't been alone. According to her recollection, he'd been engaged in what appeared to be an intense conversation with another person she couldn't identify in the shadows behind the barn. Hanson described hearing raised voices, though she couldn't make out specific words over the noise from nearby carnival rides. The conversation had struck her as unusual because Marcus was typically soft-spoken and polite, not the type to engage in public arguments. She'd noticed because it seemed out of character but hadn't thought much of it until news of his disappearance spread through town. Sheriff Keller's investigation team interviewed Hanson multiple times, trying to extract additional details about the mysterious second person. Was it a man or woman? How tall? What were they wearing? But Hanson's memory proved frustratingly incomplete. The lighting behind the barn had been poor, and she'd been busy serving customers corn dogs and funnel cake. All she could say with confidence was that Marcus had appeared upset or agitated during the brief glimpse she'd caught. The potential confrontation angle led investigators to examine Marcus's relationships more closely. They interviewed his teammates, looking for signs of conflict or rivalry that might have escalated at the fair. They spoke with former girlfriends, checking for jealousy or romantic complications that could have turned violent. They even questioned Sarah extensively, probing whether their relationship was as stable as everyone believed. Every lead crumbled under scrutiny. Marcus's teammates described him as universally liked and respected. His former girlfriends had nothing but positive memories. Sarah's account never wavered. Their relationship was strong, their plans for the future solid, their last conversation completely normal. The more investigators dug, the more Marcus Thompson appeared to be exactly what he seemed, a genuinely good kid with no enemies and no reason to disappear voluntarily. By Wednesday, the investigation had generated dozens of false leads that consumed precious resources and investigative time. A truck driver claimed to have seen Marcus at a rest stop near Grand Island, but security footage showed it was someone else entirely. A convenience store clerk in North Platte was certain Marcus had bought gasoline Sunday morning, until the timestamp on the receipt proved the transaction had occurred before his disappearance. A teenage runaway in Omaha thought she'd met Marcus at a youth shelter, but her description included details that didn't match. Wrong height, wrong eye color, wrong voice. Each false lead followed the same devastating pattern. Initial excitement and hope, careful investigation and verification, Then the crushing realization that they were chasing shadows while Marcus remained missing. Sheriff Keller found herself caught between thoroughness and desperation, knowing that every hour spent investigating bogus sightings was an hour not spent finding the real truth. The most painful false lead came Thursday evening when Marcus's own mother thought she spotted him in the parking lot of Henderson's Farm Supply. Diana Thompson had driven there to post another missing person flyer when she saw a tall figure in a letter jacket walking between the buildings. Her heart stopped, then began racing as she ran toward the person, calling Marcus's name. It was Jake Morrison, wearing his own football jacket, and the look of hope dying in Diana's eyes would haunt him for years. Winter arrived early that year, blanketing Millfield in snow by mid-October and sealing the county fair case files under a growing layer of bureaucratic frost. Sheriff Patricia Keller sat in her office on a February morning, 6 months after Marcus's disappearance, staring at 3 cardboard boxes that contained everything they'd learned about the night of September 19th, 1998. Witness statements that contradicted each other, photographs of empty fairgrounds, evidence bags containing nothing more significant than a few cigarette butts, and a torn concert ticket that had no connection to Marcus Thompson. The Nebraska State Patrol had officially transferred the case back to local jurisdiction after exhausting their resources and expertise. Federal involvement had lasted exactly 11 days, long enough for FBI agents to determine that there was no evidence of interstate transportation or federal crime. Marcus Thompson had simply evaporated from a county fair in rural Nebraska, leaving behind no ransom demands, no body, no digital trail, and no rational explanation for his disappearance. The telephone calls had stopped coming weeks ago. Reporters found other stories to chase. The reward fund established by the Methodist Church had grown to $12,000, but potential witnesses had long since shared everything they remembered or imagined they remembered. The dogs had been brought back twice more, but Rex and his handler Jim Crawford could only confirm what they'd established on that first Sunday. Marcus's scent trail ended at the highway, as if he'd been lifted into the air and transported beyond the reach of earthly detection methods. Robert Thompson aged 10 years in 6 months. His shoulders developed a permanent stoop, as if he were carrying an invisible weight that grew heavier each day his son remained missing. He'd taken unpaid leave from his job at the farm supply company to coordinate search efforts, spending his savings on gasoline for volunteers and photocopying expenses for missing person flyers. Diana found him most nights in Marcus's bedroom, sitting on the edge of the unmade bed, holding his son's football helmet and staring at recruitment letters that would never be answered. Diana herself had developed a ritual that worried her closest friends. Every evening at 9:43 p.m., she drove to the Peterson Field where the fair had been held, parking her car in the exact spot where the Ferris wheel had stood. She'd sit there for 32 minutes, the length of time between Marcus's last words to Sarah and the fair's closing announcement, as if maintaining this vigil might somehow reverse time and bring her son home. The marriage began showing stress fractures that had nothing to do with blame, and everything to do with grief processed differently. Robert wanted to hire private investigators they couldn't afford. Diana wanted to consult psychics and mediums who claimed they could communicate with the missing or dead. Both parents found themselves unable to comfort each other because their own emotional reserves had been completely depleted by the constant gnawing uncertainty of not knowing. Sarah Walsh left Millfield in August 1999, accepting a scholarship to Iowa State University that she'd previously planned to decline in order to stay close to Marcus. The decision tortured her, but the ghost of her missing boyfriend haunted every street corner, every familiar place they'd shared together. Her parents thought the change of scenery might help her heal, but Sarah carried the weight of that last conversation wherever she went. "I'll be right back" became a phrase that echoed in her dreams, a promise that would never be fulfilled. Sheriff Keller requested early retirement in the spring of 2000, 6 years before she'd planned to step down. The Marcus Thompson case had consumed her professional reputation and personal peace of mind. She'd investigated hundreds of crimes during her career, but none had left her feeling so thoroughly defeated. Other sheriffs from neighboring counties began avoiding her at regional law enforcement meetings, afraid that her failure might somehow be contagious. Her successor, Deputy Tom Bradley, inherited the case files, along with the unspoken understanding that the Marcus Thompson investigation was a career-ending puzzle that had already claimed one sheriff's reputation. Bradley was a practical man who focused on solvable crimes: cattle theft, domestic disputes, DUI arrests, while the cardboard boxes in the evidence room gathered dust and the reward fund accrued modest interest that no one would ever claim. By December 2001, Marcus Thompson's disappearance had transformed from an active investigation into local folklore, the kind of story that newcomers heard during their first week in town and longtime residents mentioned in hushed tones when the county fair returned each September. 26 years had passed since Marcus Thompson walked away from a Ferris wheel and into oblivion, but his bedroom remained exactly as he'd left it on the morning of September 19th, 1998. Diana Thompson, now 71, and moving with the careful deliberation of someone whose bones had been weathered by decades of grief, still changed his sheets every 2 weeks and dusted the trophies that lined his shelves like monuments to a future that never arrived. The red and white letter jacket hung in precisely the same position on the closet door, its shoulders maintaining their broad shape, as if Marcus might return at any moment and slip it on for another Friday night football game. His acceptance letter from the University of Nebraska remained pinned to the bulletin board beside photographs of him and Sarah at last year's homecoming dance, their faces radiant with the kind of happiness that seemed impossible to recapture in the decades that followed. Robert Thompson had died 7 years earlier, his heart finally succumbing to the constant strain of carrying hope that had grown too heavy for one man to bear. Diana found herself talking to Marcus more frequently now, updating him on hometown news as if he were away at college rather than lost somewhere beyond the reach of time and explanation. She told him about the new Walmart that had opened on the highway, about how Sarah Walsh had become Dr. Sarah Gonzalez and moved to Colorado, about the way Millfield's population had dwindled to just over 2,000 as young people continued leaving for opportunities in larger cities. The annual county fair still returned to Peterson's Field every September, though it was smaller now, reflecting the economic reality of rural Nebraska in the 21st century. Fewer carnival rides, fewer food vendors, fewer families with the disposable income to spend on games and attractions. But those who remembered 1998 inevitably found their eyes drawn to the spot where the Ferris wheel once stood, as if expecting to see a 17-year-old boy in a letter jacket telling his girlfriend he'd be right back. Diana had stopped attending the fair after 2003, the year she finally accepted that Marcus wasn't coming home. The sounds of carnival music and children's laughter had become unbearable reminders of the last normal evening in her family's life. She'd grown accustomed to the annual pilgrimage of amateur investigators and true crime enthusiasts who arrived each September, hoping to solve a case that had stumped professional law enforcement for more than 2 decades. The reward fund had grown to $47,000 through compound interest and occasional donations from strangers who'd read about the case online. Diana sometimes wondered if she should donate the money to a missing children's organization, but the fund represented the last tangible connection between her son and the outside world. As long as the reward existed, the possibility remained that someone might come forward with information that could finally answer the questions that had consumed her adult life. Sheriff Bradley had been replaced by Sheriff Amanda Rodriguez in 2015, and she by Sheriff Kyle Morrison, Jake Morrison's younger brother, who'd been 8 years old when Marcus disappeared. Each new sheriff inherited the case files and the unspoken understanding that the Marcus Thompson investigation was the department's most famous failure. The evidence boxes had been transferred to digital storage, but the physical items remained in the same metal filing cabinet, gathering dust like artifacts from an archaeological dig. Henderson's farm supply had closed in 2019 when Pete Henderson finally retired, taking with him the last direct connection to Marcus's working life. The building now housed a Dollar General store that served the remaining population's basic needs, but couldn't provide the kind of community gathering place where old-timers shared stories about the boy who'd vanished at the county fair. Sarah, now Dr. Gonzalez, had returned to Millfield exactly once since leaving for college, arriving unannounced on a cold January morning in 2018 to visit Diana Thompson. The two women had sat in the kitchen, where the command post had been established 20 years earlier, drinking coffee and sharing memories that felt simultaneously vivid and ancient. Sarah had married a veterinarian she met in Colorado and had 3 children who would never know their mother's first love, but Marcus Thompson remained present in her life like a watermark on her memories. On quiet evenings, Diana sometimes heard phantom footsteps on the front porch, or thought she glimpsed a familiar silhouette walking past the living room windows. She'd learned to distinguish between hope and hallucination, but the house itself seemed to remember Marcus, creaking in familiar patterns and settling into shapes that suggested his presence. Time had moved forward for everyone except the boy, who remained 17 forever, suspended in the amber of that September night, when something went terribly wrong at a county fair in rural Nebraska. The excavator's bucket scraped against something metallic beneath 3 feet of compacted earth, producing a grinding sound that made construction foreman Luis Rivera wince. It was July 15, 2024, and the crew from Omaha Construction had been hired to expand the Millfield County Fairgrounds with a new concrete pad for food vendors, part of a modest renovation project funded by a state rural development grant. Rivera had been breaking ground on what local officials assured him was empty field, but 26 years of Nebraska weather had apparently concealed more than anyone anticipated. Rivera climbed down from the excavator cab, his work boots crunching on the mixture of dirt and gravel that had been churned up by the morning's digging. The metallic object protruding from the disturbed earth looked like a piece of twisted pipe at first glance, but as he brushed away the clinging soil with his gloved hands, the distinctive curve of bicycle handlebars began to emerge. The metal was heavily corroded, stained brown and orange by decades of moisture and soil chemistry, but the basic structure remained intact. The bicycle that emerged from its earthen grave over the next hour was a BMX-style model, the kind popular with teenagers in the late 1990s. The frame was bent and twisted, as if it had been deliberately damaged before burial, and the tires had long since rotted away, leaving only wire wheel rims and fragments of rubber clinging to the spokes. Most of the paint had been stripped away by time and corrosion, but patches of what might once have been blue still clung to protected areas of the frame. Rivera's first instinct was to treat the discovery as routine construction debris, the kind of discarded junk that often turned up when breaking new ground in rural areas. But something about the bicycle's condition bothered him. The damage seemed too systematic to be accidental, and the burial depth suggested deliberate concealment rather than casual disposal. More troubling was the location. According to his site plans, this area had been directly behind the Carnival's backstage operations during the annual county fair. By noon, Rivera had made the decision that would reopen the Marcus Thompson case after 26 years of dormancy. He called Sheriff Kyle Morrison, explaining that his crew had discovered what appeared to be a buried bicycle in an area that might have historical significance to the 1998 missing person investigation. Morrison, who'd grown up hearing stories about Marcus Thompson's disappearance, understood the potential importance immediately. Sheriff Morrison arrived at the construction site within 30 minutes, accompanied by Deputy Lisa Chen and the department's digital camera. The bicycle had been carefully excavated and now lay on a plastic tarp, its twisted frame catching afternoon sunlight that revealed details invisible in the shadowed excavation pit. Morrison knelt beside the artifact, noting the systematic nature of the damage. The handlebars had been bent backward, the seat post was snapped, and the chain had been deliberately removed. But it was Deputy Chen who made the observation that sent chills down Morrison's spine. Despite decades of corrosion, a small metal plate remained attached to the frame near the rear wheel. A manufacturer's identification tag that included a serial number. The numbers were barely legible, etched into metal that had been partially eaten away by rust, but modern enhancement techniques might be able to recover enough information to trace the bicycle's original owner. Morrison immediately secured the scene, establishing a perimeter around the excavation site while he contacted the Nebraska State Patrol's Criminal Investigation Division. The bicycle was photographed from every angle, its position relative to known landmarks carefully documented before it was transported to the state crime lab in Lincoln. The excavation area was expanded and methodically searched, revealing fragments of cloth that might once have been clothing and several small metal objects too corroded to identify without laboratory analysis. The timing of the discovery felt simultaneously fortunate and haunting. Construction on the fairground expansion had been delayed for 2 years by funding issues and permit complications. If the project had proceeded on its original schedule, the bicycle might have been discovered while Diana Thompson was still alive to learn what had been hidden beneath her feet during all those years of September vigils. She had died 6 months earlier, taking with her 26 years of unanswered questions about her son's fate. As the crime scene tape fluttered in the Nebraska wind, Sheriff Morrison found himself contemplating the cruel mathematics of time and chance. A construction project, delayed by bureaucratic complications, had finally revealed what might be the first physical evidence in the Marcus Thompson case since 1998. The bicycle's serial number represented the most promising lead in more than 2 decades. But Morrison knew that promising leads in cold cases often led to dead ends that were even more devastating than continued uncertainty. Still, as he watched the State Patrol investigators carefully loading the corroded bicycle into their evidence van, Morrison felt something he hadn't expected: hope. After 26 years of failure, they finally had something concrete to investigate, something that might lead them closer to understanding what happened to Marcus Thompson on that September night when a 17-year-old boy walked away from a Ferris wheel and disappeared forever. The call from the Nebraska State Patrol Crime Lab came on a Thursday morning in late August, 3 weeks after the buried bicycle had been transported to Lincoln for analysis. Sheriff Kyle Morrison answered on the second ring, expecting routine confirmation that the corroded artifact had yielded no usable evidence. Instead, he found himself listening to forensic specialist Dr. Rebecca Martinez explain that enhanced imaging technology had successfully recovered the bicycle's serial number, and that the results would fundamentally alter everything they thought they knew about Marcus Thompson's disappearance. The bicycle had been manufactured by Mongoose in 1997 and sold through a regional sporting goods chain that maintained detailed sales records. Within 48 hours, investigators had traced the serial number to a specific purchase made at Sportmart in North Platte on June 15, 1998, exactly 3 months before the county fair. The buyer's name on the credit card receipt made Morrison's hands shake as he held the fax document: Timothy Brennan, age 19, who had been employed as a carnival worker with Midwest Amusements during the 1998 county fair season. Timothy Brennan's name had never appeared in the original investigation files, despite the fact that he'd been working at the fair on the night Marcus Thompson disappeared. Somehow, in the chaos of interviewing carnival workers, vendors, and local volunteers, Brennan had slipped through the investigative cracks. He'd been hired just 2 weeks before the Millfield Fair as temporary help for the busy autumn season, working as a general laborer who helped set up and tear down rides, cleaned equipment, and performed whatever tasks were needed to keep the operation running smoothly. Dr. Martinez's analysis revealed additional disturbing details about the buried bicycle. The systematic damage hadn't been caused by time or environmental factors. Someone had deliberately destroyed the bike with blunt force trauma before burial. Tool marks on the bent handlebars suggested the use of a heavy wrench or similar implement, applied with enough force to permanently deform the steel frame. The chain hadn't simply fallen off due to neglect. It had been deliberately removed and was nowhere to be found in the excavation area. More significant was the discovery of organic material embedded in the bicycle's frame. Microscopic analysis revealed traces of cotton fiber consistent with denim fabric and what appeared to be human hair follicles trapped in the damaged spokes. The hair samples were too degraded for nuclear DNA analysis, but mitochondrial DNA testing might be possible if they could obtain reference samples from Marcus Thompson's maternal relatives. Sheriff Morrison contacted Diana Thompson's sister, Margaret Walsh, who lived in Denver and had served as executor of Diana's estate. Margaret agreed to provide a DNA sample, though she struggled to understand how her nephew's disappearance could be connected to a bicycle that none of them had ever seen before. The explanation Morrison provided, that the bicycle might have been used in Marcus's abduction or murder, left Margaret weeping on the telephone. 26 years of carefully managed grief suddenly reopened by the possibility that they might finally learn the truth. The investigation into Timothy Brennan revealed a pattern of behavior that should have raised red flags in 1998, if anyone had bothered to look. Brennan had been fired from his previous job at a grain elevator in Kansas for inappropriate behavior toward female co-workers. He'd been arrested twice for public intoxication and once for disorderly conduct at a bar in Colorado. Most troubling, he'd quit his job with Midwest Amusements immediately after the Millfield Fair, disappearing from the Carnival circuit without notice or forwarding address. Current records showed that Timothy Brennan, now 45 years old, was living in Pueblo, Colorado, working as a maintenance supervisor at a mobile home park, and apparently leading an unremarkable middle-aged existence. He'd married in 2003, divorced in 2011, and had no children. His credit report showed stable employment and no major financial problems, but his criminal record had accumulated several additional entries over the years. Another drunk and disorderly charge, a domestic violence complaint that was later dropped, and a 2019 arrest for harassment that resulted in a restraining order filed by a former girlfriend. Colorado authorities agreed to place Brennan under surveillance, while Nebraska investigators prepared their case for questioning him about the bicycle and Marcus Thompson's disappearance. The evidence was circumstantial, but compelling. Brennan had been present at the fair. He'd owned a bicycle that was found buried at the crime scene, and he'd fled immediately after Marcus's disappearance without providing contact information to investigators. Sheriff Morrison found himself in the strange position of simultaneously experiencing hope and dread. After 26 years, they finally had a viable suspect and physical evidence that might connect him to Marcus Thompson's fate. But reopening the case also meant reopening wounds that had never fully healed, forcing family members and community members to relive the trauma of September 1998, while confronting the possibility that the truth might be more horrific than the uncertainty they'd learned to live with. As Morrison prepared for the trip to Colorado that would bring him face to face with Timothy Brennan, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was about to disturb something that had been deliberately buried. Not just a bicycle, but secrets that someone had spent 26 years trying to keep hidden beneath the Nebraska soil. Timothy Brennan sat across from Sheriff Kyle Morrison and Colorado Detective Maria Santos in an interview room at the Pueblo Police Department, his weathered hands folded on the metal table as if he were praying. 26 years had transformed the 19-year-old carnival worker into a middle-aged man with graying temples and the kind of deep fatigue that comes from carrying secrets too heavy for one person to bear alone. When Morrison placed the enhanced photographs of the buried bicycle on the table, Brennan's carefully constructed composure finally crumbled. "I've been waiting for this day since 1998, Brennan said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I knew somebody would eventually find it. I just never expected it would take this long." What emerged over the next 4 hours was a story that was simultaneously more innocent and more devastating than anyone had imagined. Brennan explained that he'd been smoking marijuana behind the livestock barn around 9:30 on the night of September 19th, trying to avoid his supervisor who'd been riding him about his work performance. He'd seen Marcus Thompson approaching through the shadows, apparently looking for someone, and had panicked, thinking the teenager was there to report him to Fair security. The confrontation that Doris Hanson had witnessed from the food concession wasn't an argument between Marcus and a mysterious adversary. It was a frightened 19-year-old pleading with what he assumed was a straight-laced high school athlete not to get him fired from the only job he could find. Marcus, confused by Brennan's desperate rambling about needing work to support his girlfriend back in Kansas, had tried to reassure him that he had no intention of reporting anyone for anything. But the conversation had attracted the attention of someone else. Dale Hoffman, the Ferris wheel operator who'd worked carnival circuits for 30 years and had developed a paranoid obsession with protecting his operation from what he perceived as local troublemakers. Hoffman had approached the two young men, immediately assuming that Marcus was either a potential thief or an undercover law enforcement officer trying to bust carnival workers for drug use. The confrontation escalated rapidly when Hoffman, who'd been drinking heavily throughout the evening, grabbed Marcus by the arm and began dragging him toward what he claimed was a security office, but was actually a storage trailer behind the midway. Marcus had resisted, not understanding what was happening or why he was being detained by a stranger who reeked of alcohol and kept demanding to know who sent him to spy on the carnival operation. In the struggle that followed, Marcus had struck his head against the trailer's metal steps with a sickening sound that Brennan said still haunted his dreams decades later. The teenager had collapsed immediately, blood pooling beneath his skull on the packed dirt behind the trailer. Hoffman, sobering instantly when he realized what had happened, began screaming at Brennan to help him figure out what to do with the body. The bicycle had belonged to Brennan, who'd purchased it as transportation between his shared motel room and the fairgrounds. Hoffman had convinced him that they needed to create the impression that Marcus had left the fair willingly, so they'd loaded the unconscious teenager onto the bicycle and wheeled him to Hoffman's pickup truck, which was parked behind the equipment trailers where nobody would see them. Brennan maintained that Marcus had still been breathing when they put him in the truck, but admitted he wasn't certain the boy had survived the 20-minute drive to an abandoned grain silo outside town. Hoffman had insisted on burying Marcus's body at the remote location, using shovels from the carnival's equipment supply. They'd returned to the fairgrounds before dawn, where Hoffman had systematically destroyed Brennan's bicycle with a wrench, claiming that it was now evidence that could connect them to the crime. The mangled bike had been buried in the area that would later become the excavation site, while Hoffman had coached Brennan on what to tell investigators if anyone asked about the missing teenager. The most devastating revelation was that Marcus Thompson might have survived his injuries if Brennan and Hoffman had called for medical assistance instead of panicking about their own legal exposure. Dr. Martinez had estimated that the skull fracture, while serious, would have been treatable with immediate hospital intervention. Marcus had died not from malicious intent, but from two frightened men's decision to prioritize their own freedom over a teenager's life. Dale Hoffman had died of liver failure in 2009, taking his direct knowledge of Marcus Thompson's final hours to a grave in a pauper's cemetery outside Amarillo, Texas. His death meant that Timothy Brennan's confession could never be fully corroborated, but it provided enough specific details about the burial location to guide investigators to what they'd been searching for since September 1998. The abandoned grain silo, where Brennan claimed they'd buried Marcus, had been demolished in 2003 to make way for a wind farm, but ground-penetrating radar revealed anomalous readings in the soil that suggested previous excavation. The excavation that followed was conducted with archaeological precision, every cubic foot of earth carefully sifted for evidence that might confirm or contradict Brennan's account. On the third day of digging, investigators uncovered fragments of denim fabric that matched the description of what Marcus had been wearing, along with a University of Nebraska recruitment letter that had been in his wallet. Most conclusively, they found dental remains that were positively identified through records provided by Dr. James Patterson, the Millfield dentist who treated Marcus since childhood. Margaret Walsh, Diana Thompson's sister, received the news of her nephew's discovery on a crisp October morning, exactly 26 years and 1 month after his disappearance. She was 73 years old and had spent more than half her life wondering what had happened to Marcus, carrying the weight of her sister's grief even after Diana's death. The knowledge that Marcus had been murdered, that his life had ended not through calculated malice, but through a series of panic-driven decisions by two men who were more concerned with avoiding consequences than saving a teenager, brought a complex mixture of relief and rage that she struggled to process. Timothy Brennan was charged with accessory to manslaughter and failure to report a death, charges that carried a maximum sentence of 12 years in prison, but would likely result in a much lighter punishment given his cooperation with investigators and the passage of time. Colorado's extradition process moved slowly, giving Brennan several months of freedom before he would face trial in Nebraska for crimes committed when he was barely out of high school himself. The resolution of Marcus Thompson's case sent ripples through the tight-knit community of Millfield, forcing residents to confront uncomfortable questions about how well they really knew their neighbors and how many other secrets might be buried beneath the surface of small-town life. The Methodist Church organized a memorial service that drew hundreds of people, many of whom had spent decades wondering what had happened to the boy who'd walked away from the Ferris wheel and never came home. Sarah Walsh, now Dr. Sarah Gonzalez, returned to Nebraska for the memorial service, her 3 children in tow, as she attempted to explain to them why their mother was crying over a boy they'd never met. She stood at Marcus's gravesite, finally able to say goodbye to her first love after 26 years of uncertainty, but struggled to find peace in a resolution that felt simultaneously complete and utterly inadequate. Sheriff Kyle Morrison found himself reflecting on the cruel mathematics of timing and chance that had defined the Marcus Thompson case. If the fairground expansion had proceeded on schedule, Marcus's remains might have been discovered while his mother was still alive to receive closure. If Brennan had found the courage to confess years earlier, the family could have grieved properly instead of living in perpetual limbo. If 2 frightened men had made different choices on a September night in 1998, Marcus Thompson would have celebrated his 43rd birthday instead of remaining forever 17 in the memories of those who loved him. The case raised broader questions about how many other families across rural America were living with similar uncertainties, how many other cold cases might be solved if construction projects or agricultural work accidentally disturbed carefully hidden secrets. Morrison had been contacted by investigators from 3 other states who wanted to know if Brennan or Hoffman might have been involved in unsolved disappearances in areas where their carnival had operated. As autumn settled over Nebraska and the Peterson field prepared for another county fair, the Marcus Thompson case officially closed with the kind of resolution that satisfied legal requirements but left emotional wounds that would never fully heal. The truth when it finally emerged from decades of burial, proved to be neither the random violence that many had feared, nor the calculated predation that others had suspected, but something more mundane and perhaps more tragic. A series of poor decisions by flawed human beings that had ended a promising life and destroyed a family's faith in the fundamental safety of their small-town world. The bicycle that had remained hidden for 26 years had finally served its purpose, not as the getaway vehicle Hoffman had intended, but as the key that unlocked a mystery that had haunted an entire community for more than a quarter century. Sometimes, justice arrives not through brilliant detective work or advanced forensic science, but through the simple act of breaking ground in the right place at the right time, disturbing secrets that were never meant to stay buried forever. If you found yourself captivated by this tragic story of a family's 26-year search for answers, consider subscribing to explore more cold cases that have been solved through unexpected discoveries and the relentless passage of time. Share your thoughts about how communities can better protect their young people and what other mysteries might be waiting beneath the surface of small-town America.